topic which I slightly modified to be pharmaceutical manufacturing in Nigeria, capabilities, challenges, and prospects. Now, local pharmaceutical production is a critical requirement for the attainment of medicine security and indeed universal health coverage in all nations of the world. And every nation that has actually achieved universal health coverage and done very well in medicine security have taken pharmaceutical manufacturing very seriously. And that talks about government involvement many times. You see government direct involvement and government direct intervention in pharmaceutical manufacturing. And examples abound all over the world. I'd like to start with Germany. Now, there was a global market access revenue drop in Germany from 4.2 billion in 2007 to 1.7 billion in 2010. And the value of the pharma market in Germany also declined from about 11% to 7% about that same period. This same period, you had an annual pharmaceutical revenue to GDP loss of about 31 billion US dollars. What did the government do? In response to this, the government instituted the Pharmaceutical Market Restructuring Act in 2011, and that led to an increased pharmaceutical manufacturing output. There was a revamp in the pharmaceutical manufacturing in Germany, and by 2021, you had an annual revenue growth of about 5.1%. And by last year, that has grown to 5.9%. So there is consistent growth in Germany as a result of government intervention. Now you could say that this is Germany. Let's go on to Africa. We have an example also in Egypt. Egypt in 2016 experienced some dull and issues in their pharma manufacturing with limited access to raw materials. There were issues with investments in research and development and lack of competitiveness because of some form of monopoly market. And this also led to a drop in global market value, of about 22%. And when you actually also look at the trade to GDP in Egypt, it dropped from 67.5% in 2016 to 44% in 2017. Now, the government also responded. What did the government do? The government liberalized the industry and also instituted the Egyptian Drug Authority, which helped to revamp and to create an enabling environment for pharma manufacturers to thrive in Egypt. This led to sharp growth in pharma manufacturing, and the size of the pharma manufacturing in Egypt has actually grown to about 7% and is still growing as we speak. So we could see the direct intervention and involvement of government in pharma manufacturing because it's crucial to enhancing universal health coverage. Now let's come home to our nation, Nigeria. Nigeria, there have been poor investments in the healthcare system. Generally, you have between 2 to 3% of our GDP being expended on healthcare system, as against minimum of 5% recommended by the WHO. And that's why also we have heavy reliance on importation of drugs. And by 2005, we had a revised national drug policy, which one of the goals was to ensure that we have about 70% of our local manufacturing taking care of about 70% of our drug need. But despite this effort, almost 20 years after this revised national drug policy, we only have local manufacturers taking care of about 30% of our national drug requirement. And it's not ending there. Although we have about 120 pharma manufacturers in Nigeria, they take care of less than 40% of the country's population in terms of our drug requirement. So you have a situation where the local manufacturers are taking care of just about 30% or thereabout. Now, when you look at the chart on the screen, that's the chart of pharmaceutical imports. You see a consistent decrease from 2019, it was 2.8 billion, 2021, 1.3, 2022, it's 1 billion. And it will not be surprising that it's going further down as a result of the fall in the Naira value. So the challenge now is that The local leadership are not able to meet up with majority of the drug requirements in the country. Those 65% population rely on imports. Meanwhile, import now is also declining. It's a situation that, if not addressed, Nigeria will find it difficult to achieve medicine security, and indeed universal health coverage will be very difficult for us. And so, the purpose of this presentation, therefore, is to suggest collective actions that is required to enhance local pharmaceutical manufacturing in Nigeria. That is the way to go if we must achieve universal health coverage. And this brings me to my aim, which is to share my thoughts on pharmaceutical manufacturing in Nigeria with a view to making some recommendations. In order to achieve this aim, I have structured my presentation to first and foremost look at an overview of the current capabilities that we have. Thereafter, we consider some of those multi-challenges impeding the growth of local pharma manufacturing in Nigeria. And then we look at some of the prospects before we conclude with where we need to be collectively headed as a community of pharma manufacturing. Let's begin by taking a look at an overview of the current capabilities of the local pharmaceutical manufacturing in Nigeria. Now, Nigeria imports about 98% of our APIs, and maybe about 25% of the excipients and the packaging materials that we need. But I'd like to draw your attention to that chart on the screen. There's a chart of comparison between Nigeria and Indian pharma sector. We are not comparing absolute terms, we are comparing in relative terms. Now, we're going to use ratio. Now, the red bars represent Nigeria, while the blue one is for India. You see that Nigeria has about 120 pharma manufacturers operating from 180 sites. That gives you a ratio of about 1 to 1. It's slightly more than 1, but not up to 2. So I still leave it at ratio 1 to 1. But compared to that of India, having 3,000 manufacturing companies operating from 10,000 sites, that's a ratio of about 1 to 3. That tells you that every pharma manufacturer in India has about 3 sites. Whereas when you look at Nigeria, it's ratio 1 to 1. That tells you about capacity and that we are not there. We are not getting there at all. Okay. Now, this other chart is also a chart of the importation and exportation of pharmaceutical products in Nigeria between 2013 and 2022. The blue bars are those of imports, the red ones are those of exports. And you will see that there was a gradual increase in importation up till the year 2020, when it peaked at $2.9 billion. But since then, there has been a gradual decline. And also when you look at the red bars, which are the exportations, the highest point we had was actually in 2014, which was $8 million. So on the whole, this chart suggests that our pharma importation is on the decline, and at the same time, our pharma exportation is also declining. And it gives room for worry. There's a lot of concern. We shouldn't be having decline in exportation and both of them. Although I know that the NAFTA 5+5 policy has some explanation for this, but for me, I think that does not suffice. This is a cause for concern. Now, we only have about 4 companies in Nigeria that have attained WHO GMP certification, and currently I think we have just one that is producing API very recently, and then another one who has a WHO pre-qualification. So the chart on the screen also shows the general landscape of the pharma manufacturing in Nigeria. We are operating between 1.4 1.5 billion capacity as a whole sector. Meanwhile, we have the capacity to do 4 billion by 2026. So there is a lot that we need to do. Now, so we also have a situation where our growth rate in the sector has been on a decline. If you look at between 2013 and 2018, we have 8% in 2013, which has declined to about 2.9% in 2018. So generally, local manufacturing sector is not growing at the desired rate. And And with the current harsh economic environment, attainment of medicine security and indeed universal health coverage will be very challenging for our dear country. Now, so what are the issues? What are the problems? That takes me to the next scope that we'll be discussing, which are the challenges associated with local farmer manufacturing in Nigeria. There are actually several challenges, for want of time, I will just discuss three of them. One is energy, infrastructure, and then financing. Let's start with energy. According to the World Bank, 43% of Nigerians and indeed businesses in Nigeria do not have access to reliable public power supply, and that costs Nigeria about $26 billion annually. That's according to the World Bank. Similarly, the World Bank ranked countries in terms of access to public power supply, and Nigeria ranked 171 out of 190 countries. Indeed, last year, 2019, the former Vice President Oshibado, stated that we needed about 3 trillion to address the infrastructural deficit that we have. That's on infrastructure. But according to Obina, the farmer sector in Nigeria spends about 250 million naira monthly, and on the average annually about 3 billion on generation of power. Imagine if that figure is plowed directly into drug production. So generally, we have a situation where 40% of overall drug production goes on energy consumption. That is not healthy for our pharmaceutical manufacturers. So this is a major challenge. The second is that of infrastructure. And again, the World Bank ranked Nigeria in terms of our infrastructure setup. And that chart on the screen from 2017 to 2019 actually shows a decline, because it was a comparison of the ranking of Nigeria amongst 137 countries. So in 2017, we ranked 120 and declined in 2018. By 2019, we were 130 out of 137 countries on infrastructure. And like I said earlier, about 3 billion have been said to be needed. This was as of 2019 to resolve this. But with the current fall and the current devaluation of the naira, I don't know if that figure will have been doubled by now. So there is significant impact on drug distribution because of our poor infrastructural state, and this is affecting the prospects and the growth of farmer manufacturing in Nigeria. Now, the last one I will discuss is financing. Access to affordable financing options, especially for small-scale and middle-scale infrastructure in Nigeria, is actually very poor. Access is very poor, and it's a known fact that access to capital is very difficult for commercial banks, because commercial banks are not programmed in such a way to be able to encourage and help startups. They need collaterals and a lot of them. They are not able to do that. Now, we're talking about startups. What about companies that are already in existence? Even those ones that are already there, they have issues with multiple tax regimes, high interest rate, poor access to foreign exchange. So when you look at everything, both startups and those existing, there's a lot of issues when it comes to financing. But how do other countries, how do they solve this problem? And I like to look at the example of Egypt again. In Egypt, the government gets directly involved in farmer manufacturing investment. There are 8 state-owned farmer manufacturing companies in Egypt, and recently they established 45-acre mega farmer city where about 150 medicines are produced. Government recently also invested about $80 million on raw material production in Egypt, and this is with the intent of them being able to capture the Middle East and North African countries. There's a lot of space there for them to be the dominant player. So, lack of direct government funding in Nigeria, poor access to capital, significantly limits the development of local farmer manufacturing in Nigeria. But is it all stories of woe? Is it all gloomy situation? I I don't think so. We have some prospects, and I'd like to just look at a few of those prospects, three of them. One is that we have a growing population for the farmer market. Then the National Health Insurance Act of 2023, and then the global shortage of generics. Let's start with the first, which is growing population. I'd like to draw your attention again to that chart. Presently, population of Nigeria is about 220 million. We are projected to be about 377 million by 2050. That is a large market for any local drug manufacturer. And then it said that the middle class in Nigeria, or generally, accounts for about 23% of the population, and it's estimated that this middle class has a combined buying power in excess of about $28 billion. So there is no fear that if the capacity of the local pharma manufacturer is improved and increased, the market is available. There is a purchasing power to be able to access those drugs for the development of the industry. Now, secondly is the National Health Insurance Act of 2022. Initially, it was a scheme, and that scheme was meant for just the formal sector of the economy. And decades after that scheme had been in operation, you find out that it was only able to cover about 5% of Nigerians, with about 70% still paying out of pocket for healthcare expenses. Now, with the implementation of this act, it's expected that the non-formal sector will come in. That means a lot more people will have access to medicines, a lot more people will have access to medication. That will, of course, the medications are supposed to come from the local drug manufacturing company. So this is another good prospect. And the last one I'm going to discuss is that of the shortage of generics. Globally, drug manufacturers are abandoning cheap generics. Generic manufacturers are actually struggling for contracts, struggling for supplies, and as a result of that is forcing prices down, and it's causing a lot of restructuring in that setup. For instance, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States listed 137 drugs that are already in short supply as of June this year. And we know Teva, the Israeli generic giant, this year it announced that it was shifting to brand name drugs and high value generics. So much of those cheap generics are not going to be coming from Teva again. It's not only Teva. We also have Akron, which makes about 75 common generics. Their bomb backlog are shut down as of February this year. What about Lanex? With about 120 generics. They are also announcing a reorganization amidst declining revenue. So the average price of generic generally is falling. And if the generics are not coming into the country, it creates a vacuum, it creates a space. Who is supposed to fill that space? It's still the local drug manufacturers. So the prospects are there, the space is there. And the solution is to begin to work a lot more on our local drug manufacturing in order to enhance universal health coverage. So with all this, where are we going? And this is the last scope I will discuss, which is where we need to be collectively headed to enhance local drug manufacturing capacity in Nigeria. For want of time also, I have just brought up 3 points. One is that we need to pool resources together to form mega companies, probably through consortiums, then leverage robust intervention, and then pooled procurement. I'll begin with the first one, which is pooling resources together to form mega companies, maybe through consortiums. Now, the cost per unit production of pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa is said to be about 60% higher than what you have in India and China. And I would say that generally it's because of capacity. Because if you are able to leverage quantity, then at the end of the day, it will bring the price down by the time you divide by that. That's one of the major issues there. So it talks about the issue of synergy, collaboration. We need to work together the more. For instance, the Nigerian Army has a drug manufacturing company that was established in the early 2000s. Presently, they produce more than 20 solid dosage forms. They are only into solid dosage forms. Recently, about 5 years ago, the Nigerian Air Force established its own pharmaceutical manufacturing company, also solid dosage forms. and we're producing maybe just about 5 products now. The point is, will it not be better if the Army faced a solid dosage forms, and maybe the Air Force looks at liquid line, maybe the Navy looks at parenterals and topical preparations, and thereby we'll be able to pull resources together, and then we will achieve a lot more, rather than each person or each agency doing the same thing over and over again. That will help our capacity. And that's why in Nigeria you find out that the top 10 local manufacturers, they control less than 25% of the industry's revenue. It's not usually like that, but because we are mostly small scale and medium scale producers. So putting resources together, we address the weak financial base and enhance the potential to meet WHO qualification criteria. The second point is government robust intervention, and this is very clear. The government must intervene. It's very important to see drug availability as a national issue. It's not for investors alone, but the government must get involved. So we need to do a lot of advocacy with the state government, the federal government, and I think the PSN can leverage on the interest of Gombe state government, for instance, because it's from what we have seen so far, it seems Gombe state government will be interested in investing in pharma manufacturing. So there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done in that respect. And lastly, pooled procurement. This is another area that we can look at. Whether we like it or not, we still depend on importation of raw materials or finished goods and things like that. Can we pool resources together? Can we do pool procurement? It will force prices down and enhance, availability in the country. For instance, in Sudan, pool procurement in Sudan increased scale of procurement from $3 million in 2010 to $67 million in 2017. So pool procurement is another area that if we look at, it could help us enhance and further our local drug manufacturing. So in conclusion, I like to just enumerate 3 recommendations that I put forward to. And the first is that the pharmaceutical society of Nigeria should encourage local pharma companies to pool resources together to form mega companies, maybe through consortia. Whichever method, just collaborate, have a synergy. Secondly, we need continued advocacy and engagement of the government towards direct investment and also through public-private partnership in the local pharma industry. And procurement will also be another area that we can look at in order to reduce local production costs. Thank you for your attention. My references are shown.